Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today we're taking a look at the Eversolo DAC-Z8. Some of you may have seen my recent review of the DAC-Z6 alongside the Soundcloud SGD1, and I liked the DAC-6 so much that I reached out to Eversolo and asked if they'd also send me their upgrade unit, which is the DAC-Z8 here. So it's the Z8 in black, it's the Z6 in silver, and I want to start off by saying a huge thanks to Eversolo for sending me this unit for review. As always, the fact that they've sent it to me doesn't influence what I'm going to say. I'm going to tell you what I like and what I don't like, although to be honest, in this case, there's not very much that I don't like. This is another fantastic unit from a new player on the market, which I think personally is pretty exciting. And so without any further ado, let's jump in and take a look at the Eversolo DAC-Z8. As I mentioned in the intro, the DAC-Z8 is the upgrade version from the DAC-Z6. And to put them into price context, the DAC-Z6 sells for $459 US, the DAC-Z8 is going to be $699 US. Now, as new products on the market, you may not find them on a lot of websites yet, but they are coming, I believe. I should also mention that I know some of you were a little bit put off by some of the issues with the firmware on the DAC-Z6. One of the things that somebody pointed out was the misspelling of the word source. There's been a recent firmware upgrade. I've updated both of these and tested them with the new firmware, and the good news is it's added some great functionality and also fixed things like that spelling error. One specific thing that's been fixed by the firmware upgrade was something that I'd actually told Eversolo about. It was something I wasn't a fan of. I actually forgot to mention it in the DAC-Z6 review, but the good news is it's no longer relevant. Because with the new firmware, what's now happened is instead of the old system where the volume was the same, so when you unplugged your headphones, the line out was operating at whatever volume you'd had your headphones set to, and vice versa, instead of that, there's now independent volume memory for your line out versus your headphone out. And that's really important because if you've got your DAC-Z6 or your DAC-Z8 running to an external headphone amp, you're probably going to have this set to maximum volume as a line level output. And then that means that if you plug in your headphones without remembering to turn down the volume, you're going to blow out your ears. And so now instead of that, you might have the line level output set to 0 dB, which is maximum volume, and you might have your headphones set to say minus 26 dB. In that situation, it's going to remember which one's which, depending on what you've got plugged in or not plugged in. So that's great, it's all been fixed in the firmware, so if you do buy a DAC-Z6 or DAC-Z8, make sure you check the firmware version and update it if it's not already on the current version. It's a very easy update process, and then away you go. And so with all that preamble out of the way, let's now talk about what's different between the DAC-Z6 and the DAC-Z8. Because my initial thoughts when I looked at them was there maybe wasn't too much difference. But in reality, whilst there's not a huge amount of difference, the differences that are there are very significant. As you can see from this table, the DAC-Z6 uses a pair of ES9068 chips, whereas the DAC-Z8 actually uses only a single chip in the ES9038 Pro. Now that may seem like a downgrade, the fact that it's a single chip for the higher level unit instead of dual chips for the lower level unit, but that 9038 Pro chip offers a multi-channel decoding function, and that means you can essentially split the signal and kind of treat it like you're using multiple chips, even though technically it's all on the one piece of silicon. Another key difference is the op amps being used, and that's going to influence both the headphone output and the line output. We've gone from a set of Rycore chips in the DAC-Z6 to some really high quality and very commonly used in good quality devices, Texas Instruments 1612 op amps. Now that might not mean anything to you, and don't worry if it doesn't. The key takeaway for this is that the op amps being used in the DAC-Z8 are tried and tested across multiple devices. Every device I've tried that uses them seems to sound pretty good, at least where I've noticed which op amps are being used. And so because of that, we should be getting a better quality output sound. As I said, between the headphone amp and the line out should be the same. And that means that we've both got an upgrade in the DAC chip potentially, and an upgrade in the output stage. Finally, the other key difference is the number of filters. You get a lot more versatility with the filters on the DAC-Z8. But then beyond that, they're actually very similar. So both are offering the same high-res Bluetooth codecs, both are offering the same DSD and high sample rate PCM decoding. That's coming because of the same XMOS processor in each. And then they both have basically the same headphone stage. And that means that you're not getting great amounts of power out of either of these, but it's also enough for most normal headphones. They're not going to drive really difficult planar magnetics. It'll struggle on something like an Expanse or a Stealth. Obviously a Sasvara or an Abyss 1266, they're out of the question too. But for all the sorts of headphones that I would plug in to do any kind of mixing and mastering work, or basic mid-tier kind of general listening type headphones, they've all worked beautifully. Even something like the Audeze LCD5 that I've still got here, that runs beautifully off these too. So they're going to do the job for the majority of headphones, but they're not going to do the job for the very difficult headphones. Just in case you didn't see my review of the DAC-Z6, let's do a quick tour of the device with the DAC-Z8. This is going to be very familiar to you if you've seen the DAC-Z6 review because everything's identical, but it is worth giving you just a quick run through in case you haven't seen it or maybe you've forgotten. On the front panel here, it's pretty simple. We've got this lovely full color display that's going to give you the option of 3 different VU meters you can have playing, and I love those. Or if you don't like VU meters for any reason, you can just have it showing the sample rate and volume level, things like that. And then other than that, all we've got is a volume dial, which is also a press button, which is going to let you get into the menu system to change inputs, change output information, the filters, all that sort of thing. We've got a power button, and then we've got a 6.3mm headphone output. While we're talking about things like the display and the control wheel, it's really worth mentioning that the software system and the interface of the DAC-Z8, just like the DAC-Z6, is nothing short of exceptional for a brand new product on the market. And I'm not just saying that. I've had other relatively new devices, like the SMSL SD9, I think it was called, whatever the little streaming device was, and that showed a lot of issues with the firmware and the software and the general layout. Whereas what I'm finding with the Eversolos is that even though they had that slight whoopsie with the spelling of source on the original firmware, the actual layout, the simplicity of navigation, the functions and features available are all absolutely top notch. And so I want to give real credit to them because that's often something that takes a while to get right. And I think Eversolo have absolutely nailed it in their first attempt. The fact that they were so responsive in fixing the firmware for the spelling and the volume control that I mentioned before is another sign that they're a company looking to get this just right. And I think they're well on the right track. Something else that I really like about the DAC-Z6 and the DAC-Z8 is the fact that they give you selectable outputs. So you've got the ability to choose between no-line outputs, RCA only, XLR only, or both. And that's fantastic if you want to run to multiple amplifiers potentially, maybe you want to run to studio monitors, but be able to sometimes switch them off. You've got lots of versatility and flexibility. And that's not unheard of. There's plenty of other devices, the recently reviewed Topping DX5, the DX7 Plus Pro. A lot of those allow you to do similar things, but it's nice to see it implemented once again here. And so in terms of the actual features and functions through the front panel, I think everything's just right. And so let's quickly take a look at the back of the device to see what else is on offer. Looking at the back of the DAC-Z8, we've got a pair of XLR outputs and a pair of RCA outputs, so this is a fully balanced unit. We've then got split-off inputs of coaxial and optical. And then we've got 2 different USB inputs. You've got USB-B and USB-C, which is nice. There's a Bluetooth aerial I mentioned before. This does high-res Bluetooth, so you've got LDAC and aptX HD capabilities. Below the Bluetooth aerial, we've got a USB socket, which is for the firmware upgrades. As I said before, it's a really simple process. You download the package of the firmware, you put it onto an empty blank USB stick, you put the stick in the back, go through the menu system, choose the upgrade function, and then sit back and relax. Very straightforward, very easy, and probably pretty foolproof. Finally, after that, all we've got left is a regular IEC connector for your mains cable from the power. And so things are pretty simple, pretty straightforward. I would have loved to see something like an I2S connector here, but I'm not going to hold it against them because at $699, you don't see a lot of DACs with I2S. There are a couple around, but it's not particularly common. And so what we've got on our hands here is a great looking, well-featured DAC with a fantastic interface. And so then everything else is going to come down to 2 questions. Firstly, how does it sound in general? But also, is it worth the upgrade over the cheaper DAC-Z6? Do the upgrades to the DAC chip and the op amps make enough difference to make it worthwhile spending an extra $150 odd? So let's jump into that now and find out. Trying to work out what gear you should buy next? Have a look at the Passion for Sound Recommends link down in the description below. Clicking on the link will take you through to my Patreon page and specifically a post where you can click on the Airtable image to go through to my recommended product database. Once you're in the database, you can use the filter button up the top to choose which sorts of product types you want to have a look at, maybe headphones, maybe DACs, maybe amps. Choose the one or ones that you want to see from this list, and then you can also sort the list by price if you want to, or other features as well. You'll then see a consolidated list just of the product types you want to have a look at, including things like what the retail price was when I last checked. You've got links to my reviews of each product, and then also links to where you can go and buy them. Feel free to play around with the filters and sorting options as much as you like to find the gear you're looking for, and I hope that this database points you in just the right direction for you. So happy hunting, happy listening, and now let's get back to the review. The first test that I did with the DAC-Z8 was just to try out the headphone output. And so I plugged in the Meza Elites straight out of the 6.3mm socket here and took a listen. For this testing, I was using the fast linear phase filter. And one of the tracks I used was Over the Hill by Loudon Wainwright. Running in high gain from both the DAC-Z8 and the DAC-Z6, I was at volume minus 25 dB, so that's roughly in the center of the scale. It runs from minus 60 to 0 dB. And so running at about 50% output from these guys into a headphone like the Meza Elite, which is pretty easy to drive. So it gives you the sense that it's not a powerful headphone amp in here, as I've already covered off. But what I was most interested in was how the quality was, more so than the power. As I said before, it will drive most headphones to slightly louder than normal listening levels, well within the comfort zone. And what I mean is within, say, less than 75% volume on these, you're going to get really loud or normal listening levels. Listening to Over the Hill with the Meza Elites plugged into the DAC-Z8, what I heard was a sound that is nice and crisp, but not harsh, not edgy, never dry or sterile, but a good sense of texture and clarity. The size of the soundstage produced is very good. There's not a huge amount of depth, as is normal for any kind of chip-based Delta Sigma type DACs, but it's not bad at all, and the instrument separation is really strong from the Z8 for a DAC at this price. Quickly jumping over to the Z6 just to give me some context, what I heard was a sound from the Z6 that's just a little bit thicker. It's a little bit more closed in. It's not congested as such, but you can definitely hear that the Z8 is giving you more space in the sound, more separation of instruments. It's clearly an upgrade in sound quality, but the Z6 is still strong. The Z8's just better. And the thing that kept standing out to me about the Z8 was its ability to sound so clean and crisp, but never sterile. It's a great balance of clarity and precision and resolution and detail without straying into the realm of an artificial tonality or an overly forward and kind of in-your-face approach. It balances that really, really well, and I find it thoroughly enjoyable to listen to. And so with a quick comparison of the headphone amp stage, even though the power is identical from the two, the performance is clearly better from the Z8. It is clearly the better DAC, or I probably should say all-in-one for this. When using the headphone output, if you want maximum performance, it is worth spending more money on the Z8 compared to the Z6. And that doesn't make the Z6 bad. As I said in my review of that one, it's a really solid performer. But if you do have extra money to spend, you are going to be rewarded by going up to the Z8, at least for the headphone stage. And so that did bode pretty well for using it as a pure DAC. And so let's talk about pure DAC use now. The first thing that I tested was to make sure that the outputs were identical, or as close to identical as you can get from the RCA and the XLR, and the good news is that they're indistinguishable. So if you want to run this to a single-ended amp or powered speaker, or a balanced one, either way it's going to perform just as well. That's great news if you're someone like me that maybe has a tube amp running off the single-ended, and maybe a solid-state amp running off the balanced. You can absolutely enjoy equal quality sound regardless of which way you go. As I've often said in other reviews, I always find it difficult to describe the sound of DACs and amps in isolation, because out of context, they almost all sound pretty good, unless there's a major flaw. And so I jumped straight at this stage into comparing the DAC-Z8 to the DAC-Z6 once again, but this time using both of them connected via curious XLR cables and into the Soloist GT from Burson Audio. The Meza Elites were again my headphone of choice for this, and one of the tracks I listened to was Padre by Tommy Emmanuel. The first thing that I found was that if I didn't kind of really critically listen to these two, it was hard to tell the difference. It's not like it's a huge night and day jump as you switch between the two. And in fact, one of the first tracks that I started to make notes on, and I haven't written down what the track was, but it was a busier track. There was a lot more going on, and it was harder to actually notice the differences between the two on the really busy track than it was with the very simple solo acoustic guitar track being Padre by Tommy Emmanuel. What I found as I listened to the more simple track though, was that the Z8's just bringing out a little bit more of the nuance in the sound. I was able to hear the subtle textures from the guitar, so things like the sound of fingers on the strings on the fretboard, or the exact character of a strum or a pluck of the string, the resonance of the body of the guitar, all those things were just a little bit better defined from the Z8 than they were from the Z6. Again, it was a small step, but it was clearly different. Another thing the Z8 was able to produce for me was more of a sense of the room. So in the case of the Z6, it sounded like I was listening to a recording, whereas from the Z8, it started to sound like I was maybe in the room with a musician. And I'm not saying it was a perfect rendition and that I absolutely could close my eyes and imagine I was there, but it was closer, significantly closer with the Z8 because I could start to hear the room, little reflections off the walls, just that general sense of ambience and space around that focal guitar. Tonality of the two is otherwise essentially identical. And as I flipped through multiple other tracks, the other thing that started to stand out, and this was quite track dependent, was that on the Z6, the staging was a bit more narrow and there was a bit less separation of instruments. So much like what I said with the headphone stage, what you're hearing with the Z8 compared to the Z6 is the ability to start to give you more space in the sound, more separation in the sound. And depending on the amplifier you have, the Z8 is able to extract just that bit more detail, texture, room ambience, all those very, very subtle, very, very fine cues that a really top-notch DAC is going to pull out, and a slightly lesser DAC, and it's not a knock on the Z6, but a slightly lesser, more basic DAC is not going to give you quite as well. And so at this point, I was pretty impressed with the Z8, but I was so far only comparing it to a cheaper model in the Z6, and so I wanted to see how good was it really. Being a $699 Delta Sigma DAC, I was kind of keen to see how it compared to a more expensive, still Delta Sigma based DAC. And so I reached for the Burson Audio Composer. Thanks to Burson Audio using their discrete op amps in the Composer, it's one of the best Delta Sigma DACs I've found at or around that $1,000 mark. And so to me it seemed like a really strong challenge for the Z8. Once again, I was using Curious XLR cables to feed into the Soloist GT, and I made sure to volume match the two DACs before I moved forward. And just for those who might be curious, what that meant was running the Composer, I think on volume 85 out of 100, because it's got a slightly higher output level than the DAC-Z8. The Composer uses a fully digital volume control that's not discarding bits, and so you're going to get exactly the same performance at level 85 to 100 to 60, and so I was able to make it a completely fair comparison just by pulling back that output level slightly on the Composer. One of the tracks I listened to for this test was This Is Hip by John Lee Hooker and Rykuda, and what I heard from the two DACs was actually very similar sounds once again. It took me a few goes going back and forth to really understand what I was hearing that was different, and so what I really heard was tonality that again was pretty much on the mark. So all three of these DACs, the DAC-Z6, the DAC-Z8 and the Composer, on a pure tonality point of view, they're almost indistinguishable, to the point that I don't think I'd be able to pick them blind if you just gave me the tonality to listen to. Where things did start to separate them a little bit though is in the presentation of the stage. The Z8 comes across just a little bit flatter compared to the Composer, and I'm going to put that down to the fact that the Composer is using that discrete output stage, and that generally helps to produce a sense of depth. And so what I found as I went back and forth between the two was that I just got slightly more sense of space in the, I guess you'd call it the Z-axis in the soundstage, which is the depth from the front to the back of the stage. That was just a little bit better from the Composer. It still wasn't huge. It's not like going to an R2R DAC or a shit multi-bit DAC or a chord DAC. But certainly there was a slight difference going from the Z6 to the Z8 and then what I heard with the Composer. And that's not to say that the Z8 is bad in any way, it just goes to show you that you can get a little bit more performance if you're happy to spend a bit more money on something like a Composer. As I continued to listen to more tracks and bounce back and forth between the two, the other thing I started to notice was that there's just a slightly kind of drier, maybe slightly more textural sound from the Z8, and therefore it means the Composer is just a touch smoother, but we're talking absolutely a hair's breadth of difference. And so again, I don't think I could pick these blind on tonality. There is a little difference, but it's so small. And then even when you throw in the depth of the soundstage, that would be difficult too. And I say that just to put into context the fact that we're not talking huge leaps here. There is a clear step from the Z6 to the Z8 and then to the Composer, but each one is an incremental step. And so for me, I'd be hard pressed to say you should spend more money on the Composer than something like the Z8. And that's partly because the difference isn't huge, but it's also because you're getting a headphone output here and also this wonderful display with VU meters, more controls and functionality, you've got more inputs and outputs as well. And so for me, the Z8 is offering really good value. Yes, the Composer is still better. If you said to me out of this review, which is the absolute best DAC, the Composer is by a small amount. But if you said to me which one would you personally buy, as in if you were asking me that question, I'd be taking the Z8. I love the Burson gear, I'm always a fan of their work, but unless you're going to go to a shit multi-bit DAC like say a Bifrost 264, or you're going to go to something like a chord DAC in the Mojo 2 or the Cutest, there are only very small gains to be had as you move up the rings of Delta Sigma DACs. And that's where I think that Eversolo have really found a sweet spot here. I think the $699 price tag is about right for how it performs. I think it's giving you close enough to that $1,000 price tag that you start to question the value in spending more money. And so I hope this has given you a nice insight into the DAC-Z8. I can't stress enough how impressed I am with what Eversolo have managed to do with their first two DACs on the market. And just to be really, really clear here, there is no affiliation whatsoever. I don't get any benefit if you buy these. I actually generally get more benefits with you buying other products from places like Topping, SMSL, etc. And so what I'm saying here is that with no bias, with no vested interest in you buying this over any other DAC, I think this is one of the best DACs that's come across my desk. And in fact, the DAC-Z8 is going to become, for now at least, until something better comes along, this is going to become my new kind of go-to do-everything DAC. I can use it for my editing and mixing via the headphone output and or through the studio monitors. I love the look of it on my desk. I love the VU meters. It just does everything right at the price. And so just to recap this all again, if you can spend more money, you can get better sound, but it's going to be an incremental step unless you're happy to jump across to something like a Bifrost 264 or a Chord Mojo 2. I haven't compared those two directly, but I can tell you straight off the bat that those sorts of devices, being the shit multi-bit at that level and the Chord DACs, are both going to give you much better sense of depth and layering in the soundstage. But if you don't want to go down that path and you want a more fully featured setup, then this is absolutely a brilliant choice. So bravo to Eversolo for making two wonderful devices, particularly the Z8, and I hope that having seen this review, you'll now consider Eversolo as a good option in your purchase decisions. If you have found the review useful, interesting, enjoyable, I'd love it as always if you hit the like button, and consider subscribing and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound. But in reality, yeah.